My manager didn't hesitate even for a second. He pointed straight at me across the conference room table and said firmly, "It had to be her. The numbers don't lie." The room went absolutely dead silent, the kind of silence that presses on your eardrums and makes you aware of your own heartbeat. I felt every single eye in that cramped conference room turn toward me simultaneously, like spotlights swiveling to illuminate a stage. My throat tightened so fast and so completely, I couldn't even swallow. Couldn't force air past the sudden constriction. 20 people sat around that table, coworkers I'd worked alongside for 7 years, HR representatives I'd smiled at in hallways, district managers I'd only met twice. And every single one of them was now staring at me like I'd transformed into someone they'd never seen before. My hands, resting on the fake wood table, stayed perfectly still through sheer force of will. But inside, my entire body was screaming. This wasn't real. This couldn't be happening. Not to me. Not after everything I'd done for this company. He slid a clear plastic evidence bag across the polished conference table with deliberate slowness, making sure everyone could see what he was presenting. Inside was my register log from Tuesday night, creased from handling, covered with yellow highlighting, circled an aggressive red marker that had bled through the paper. The numbers were marked up like a crime scene, annotated with question marks and arrows pointing to specific transactions. "Her shift," he added calmly, his voice steady and certain, tapping the plastic bag for emphasis. "The discrepancy appeared during her closing procedures. $2,000 missing from the safe. The timeline is clear." He said it like this was already settled, like we were just going through necessary formalities before the inevitable conclusion, like my guilt was a mathematical certainty rather than an accusation requiring proof. I stared at that bag, at my own handwriting visible through the plastic, and felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't an investigation. This was a predetermined outcome looking for justification. No one defended me. Not a single coworker spoke up on my behalf or questioned the narrative being constructed around that highlighted register log. Not Rachel, who I'd covered for countless times when she needed to leave early for her kids. Not Tom, whose register shortages I'd helped him find and fix without reporting them to management. Not Brianna, who'd cried in the break room last month about her divorce while I listened and brought her coffee. HR representatives avoided my eyes completely, looking down at their notes or across at the wall, anywhere but at me, like I was contagious with something they didn't want to catch. My chest burned with something hotter and more painful than fear, something that felt like betrayal, mixed with rage, mixed with disbelief. These were people I'd worked with for years, people I'd helped and supported and covered for. And now, when I needed someone to say, "Wait, that doesn't make sense," or "Natalie wouldn't do this," there was only silence. Complicit, cowardly silence. "I trusted you, Natalie," my manager said, shaking his head slowly from side to side like a disappointed parent addressing a wayward child. The disappointment in his voice felt rehearsed, practiced, like he'd prepared the speech beforehand. "You've been here 7 years. I gave you extra responsibilities, more hours, closing shifts, and this is how you repay that trust?" He paused dramatically, letting his words sink in, making sure everyone in the room absorbed the narrative of betrayal he was constructing. I watched his performance with growing clarity, and something clicked into place in my mind. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't a manager genuinely trying to understand how money had gone missing. This was theater. This was a carefully staged production with predetermined roles. Him as the betrayed authority figure, me as the convenient scapegoat. And everyone else in this room was the audience, watching the show, accepting their parts without question. I realized with sudden, crystalline certainty that he'd planned this entire confrontation before I'd even walked into the room. The HR director, a woman named Patricia, whom I'd always thought was fair, cleared her throat uncomfortably and adjusted the papers in front of her. "Natalie, until we can fully resolve this situation and complete our investigation, you're being placed on suspension, effective immediately." Her voice was professional, carefully neutral, stripped of any emotion. "You'll need to surrender your badge and keys before leaving the building today." My employee badge, which I'd worn every single day for 7 years, was gently taken from me by a security officer who wouldn't meet my eyes. That gentleness somehow hurt more than aggression would have. It was the careful handling you'd give to something contaminated, something you needed to touch but didn't want to acknowledge. The badge had my photo from my first day, when I'd been excited about this job, when I'd thought hard work and honesty mattered. Now it was evidence in someone else's story about my supposed crime. I watched it disappear into another plastic bag and felt part of my identity being erased. I walked out through the store I'd helped run for 7 years, past checkout lanes I'd opened countless mornings, past shelves I'd helped stock and organize. Customers browsed aisles completely unaware that inside that conference room, my name was being systematically destroyed, my reputation dismantled, piece by piece. They didn't know that the reliable employee who'd helped them find products and solve their problems was now labeled a thief. My hand stayed steady as I pushed through the exit doors. My posture remained straight through sheer stubborn will. But my stomach churned violently, twisted into knots that made me wonder if I'd make it to my car before being sick. The afternoon sunlight felt too bright, too normal for what had just happened. The parking lot looked exactly the same as it had this morning when I'd arrived for what I'd thought was a routine meeting. But everything had changed. My entire professional life had just collapsed in less than 30 minutes, and I didn't even fully understand how or why yet. My name is Natalie Brooks, and I'm 31 years old. I've worked in retail since college, moved up from cashier to supervisor to assistant manager over years of consistent performance. And I didn't steal a single dollar, not from this company or any other, not ever in my entire life. The accusation wasn't just wrong. It was the opposite of everything I'd built my career on. I'd always been the person who found money left in carts and turned it in, the person who counted drawers 3 times to make sure they were perfect, the person who stayed late to help fix discrepancies in other people's registers, without complaint. My entire professional identity was built on reliability and honesty. That's who I was. That's who I'd always been. But in that conference room, surrounded by people who'd worked with me for years, none of that mattered. My history didn't matter. My record didn't matter. Only that highlighted register log mattered. And the story my manager wanted to tell about it. I'd balanced cash drawers for 7 years without a single significant shortage that couldn't be explained and corrected immediately. No warnings in my personnel file, no disciplinary actions, no complaints about my handling of money or store property. My annual reviews consistently rated me as exceeding expectations. I'd received bonuses for accuracy. I'd been trusted with closing procedures, safe combinations, bank deposits. My record was spotlessly clean because I was genuinely careful, genuinely honest. I took pride in precision, in getting numbers right, in being someone management could rely on without question. That clean record wasn't luck or accident. It was the result of 7 years of showing up, doing the work correctly, taking responsibility seriously. But apparently none of that history counted against one night's missing money and a manager's finger pointing in my direction. 7 years of proof didn't matter when someone needed a scapegoat badly enough. The unfairness of it burned like acid in my chest. My manager had always joked easily with his favorites, the younger employees, who laughed at his comments and asked him about his weekend. They got preferred schedules, better shifts, forgiveness for mistakes. I'd never been part of that inner circle. I was the person who fixed their register errors quietly without making them look bad. The person who covered their shifts when they called out. The person who stayed late to finish their incomplete tasks. Reliability never gets applause or appreciation. It just gets more responsibility piled on. You become invisible in your competence, expected to handle everything smoothly, while others get credit for being personable or enthusiastic. I'd never minded being the reliable one. I'd actually preferred it to the political games and social dynamics. But now I understood the danger of that invisibility. When something went wrong, when someone needed to be blamed, the reliable person became the convenient target. Because we were already invisible anyway. Nobody would defend someone they'd never really noticed. $2,000 had vanished from the store safe overnight between Tuesday's closing and Wednesday's opening. No forced entry. No triggered alarms. No signs of external tampering. Just money that should have been there, but wasn't. The discovery had happened during Wednesday's opening procedures, when the morning manager couldn't reconcile the safe count with the previous night's deposit documentation. By lunchtime, district management was involved. By afternoon, they'd pulled register logs and shift schedules. And by the next morning, I was sitting in that conference room being accused. The speed of it should have seemed suspicious. How quickly they'd identified me as the culprit. How readily they'd built their case. But in that moment, I'd been too shocked to analyze their process. Later, when I could think clearly again, I'd recognize all the signs of a predetermined conclusion. They hadn't investigated to find out what happened. They'd investigated to confirm what someone had already decided had happened. And that someone was my manager. He'd said very clearly that it was my drawer, my responsibility, my shift. But I remembered closing that Tuesday night with perfect clarity. I remembered counting the cash 3 times like I always did. I remembered filling out the deposit slip with exact amounts. I remembered locking the safe and double-checking the combination. Every detail was crystal clear in my mind because I'd done it hundreds of times, and I always did it the same way. Memory sharpens dramatically when you're accused of something you didn't do. Suddenly, every detail matters, every timestamp becomes significant, every action you took needs to be defensible. I could recall exactly who else had been in the store, what time I'd finished closing procedures, what I'd heard on the radio during my drive home. But none of that had mattered in the conference room. My manager had his story, his evidence, his conclusion. My memory was irrelevant compared to his highlighted register log and confident accusations. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table and composed a carefully worded email to HR requesting the complete incident report. No emotion in my writing. No exclamations or capital letters or desperate pleas. Just calm, professional language asking for documentation that should be provided to any employee facing disciplinary action. I formally request copies of all documents related to the cash shortage investigation, including the complete incident report, register reconciliation records, and my personnel file. Please advise on the timeline for receiving these materials. I proofread it 5 times before sending, making sure my tone was perfectly professional. Their reply came the next morning. We're reviewing the matter internally. We'll provide documentation as appropriate when the investigation concludes. That non-answer told me everything I needed to know. They weren't investigating. They were protecting themselves and building their case. But if they thought I'd simply accept suspension and eventual termination without fighting back, they'd badly underestimated who they were dealing with. I might be quiet, but I wasn't weak. Within 2 days, my manager was apparently telling coworkers a completely different version of events. According to the gossip that reached me through a former colleague who still felt guilty enough to text me, he was saying I'd broken down during the meeting, that I'd confessed without words through my silence and body language, that I'd basically admitted guilt by not defending myself more aggressively. He was rewriting the conference room confrontation into a story where my shock and silence became proof of guilt, rather than the natural reaction of an innocent person being blindsided by false accusations. I didn't respond to these reports. I didn't call people to correct the narrative or defend my character. Silence became my shield, my strategy, my weapon. Let him talk. Let him build his story on assumptions and interpretations. Let him feel confident that his version of events was becoming accepted reality. Because I knew something he apparently didn't understand. In retail, everything is recorded. Every transaction, every movement, every moment is captured by cameras designed to prevent exactly the kind of theft he was accusing me of. I formally requested the security footage 3 days after my suspension, using the same carefully professional language I'd used in my previous emails. I am formally requesting access to all security camera footage from the store for Tuesday, March 14th, from 8 p.m. through midnight, covering all relevant areas, including the safe, registers, and back office. Please provide raw files from all available camera angles. I sent copies to HR, to district management, and to the corporate compliance office. I made sure my request was documented in multiple places, created a paper trail that couldn't be ignored or conveniently lost. There was a noticeable pause before any reply came. A day of silence. Then 2 days. On the third day, I received a brief response. Your request is being reviewed by our legal department. That delay, that hesitation, told me I was on the right track. If the footage clearly showed what my manager claimed it showed, me stealing money, they would have handed it over immediately as damning evidence. The delay meant something else entirely. Days passed with no further communication. Then a week. Each day of silence was clearly intended to increase pressure, to make me panic, to push me toward accepting guilt for something I hadn't done. They were betting that a suspended employee without income would eventually crack, would accept whatever settlement they offered, just to make the situation go away. But the pressure had an opposite effect on me. Instead of making me panic, it sharpened my focus and patience. I'd spent 7 years being reliable, being steady, being the person who stayed calm during chaos. That training served me well now. I used the time productively. I filed for unemployment, citing suspension without cause. I documented every communication. I researched my legal rights and state employment laws. I prepared methodically for whatever came next. And I waited, because I knew that innocent people who stay calm and demand evidence eventually force the truth to surface. Guilty people panic and run. Innocent people wait for proof. I pulled out a notebook and began reconstructing every single minute of my Tuesday shift with obsessive detail. I wrote down what time I'd arrived, who else was working, who'd logged into which register. I documented every manager who'd accessed the safe that day. I noted who'd left early, who'd stayed late, who'd been in the back office. I created a timeline with timestamps pulled from my memory, from texts I'd sent, from receipts showing when I'd stopped for gas on my way home. Truth loves timelines. Truth thrives on specifics and details and documentation. Lies require vagueness and assumptions and gaps in memory. I had exact details because I'd actually been there, actually done my job correctly, actually followed every procedure. My timeline was precise because it was real. And somewhere in that precision, I was confident there was evidence that would contradict whatever story my manager was telling. I just needed access to the cameras that had recorded everything I was now documenting from memory. 2 weeks after my suspension, HR scheduled another meeting for the following Monday to discuss resolution of the outstanding investigation, their email said. The formal language poorly disguised what they actually meant. To pressure me into resigning or accepting termination. My manager would be present. District management would attend. I was welcome to bring representation if I wished. I accepted the meeting without requesting a lawyer, though I'd consulted one by phone. I knew what they expected. Either desperate pleading for my job or angry defensive outbursts they could use as further evidence of my supposed guilt. When I walked into that conference room on Monday morning, my manager smiled when he saw me. That smile was confidence. He thought this meeting was the end, the final scene in his carefully directed production. He thought I'd been broken by 2 weeks of suspension and isolation. He had no idea what was coming. I'd spent those 2 weeks preparing. And I'd finally received, just Friday afternoon, the security footage I'd requested. The conference room lights dimmed as the IT technicians set up the video equipment. The security footage loaded slowly on the large screen at the front of the room, progress bar inching across as files buffered. Static filled the screen first, gray and crackling. Then movement appeared, the familiar layout of our store's back office, viewed from the ceiling-mounted camera. The timestamp in the corner read Tuesday, March 14, 9:47 p.m. My manager shifted in his chair, still confident. He'd probably assumed this footage would show me accessing the safe, would confirm his accusations. The HR director watched the screen impassively. District management leaned forward slightly. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded calmly on the table in front of me, my breathing steady. I'd watched this footage 3 times over the weekend, memorizing every relevant moment. I knew exactly what was about to appear on that screen. I knew exactly when my manager's confident smile would disappear. And I waited for truth to play itself out in high-definition clarity. The footage showed someone entering the back office at 10:23 p.m. after the store had closed to customers. The figure moved with familiar confidence, someone who knew exactly where they were going. They approached the safe directly, knelt down, and began working the combination. It clearly wasn't me. The build was wrong, the height was wrong, the movement patterns were wrong. The person opened the safe, reached inside, pulled out several stacks of bills, and methodically placed them into a dark bag. The timestamp blinked steadily in the corner. 10:23 p.m., 10:24 p.m., 10:25 p.m. Each moment recorded like a heartbeat, documenting theft in real time. My manager had gone very still, no longer smiling. The HR director's expression had shifted from impassive to intensely focused. I continued watching the screen even though I'd seen this before, even though I knew what came next. The figure stood, closed the safe, checked the office quickly, and turned toward the camera. For just a moment, a clear moment, their employee badge swung into view, reflecting the office lights. The technician zoomed the footage slightly at my request, enhancing the detail around the badge. The image wasn't perfect. Security cameras never are, but it was clear enough. The badge number was partially visible. More importantly, the badge photo was visible if you looked closely, and it absolutely, definitely, unmistakably wasn't me. The room had gone completely silent, everyone staring at the screen with varying degrees of shock and recognition. "Can you replay that section?" the district manager asked quietly. The technician rewound the footage and played it again. Then again at my manager's stammered request. Each replay made it clearer, more undeniable, more damning. The person accessing the safe on Tuesday night at 10:23 p.m., when I was already home and texting my sister about dinner plans, when I'd already completed my shift and locked up, was my manager. The same manager who'd pointed at me across this conference room 2 weeks ago. The same manager who'd accused me so confidently. The room turned absolutely cold, the temperature seeming to drop as everyone processed what they were seeing. No one breathed. No one moved. The only sound was the video rewinding again, the soft whir of the laptop speakers replaying the footage that destroyed every accusation that had been made against me. My manager's face had gone pale, then flushed red, then pale again. His hands gripped the edge of the table like he needed it for balance. The confident smile from earlier had vanished completely, replaced by something that looked like panic barely contained. That's not what it looks like," he started, his voice shaking slightly. "I can explain. I was checking the deposit. I thought there was an error. I was trying to..." He talked faster and faster, words tumbling over each other, explaining and correcting and deflecting in increasingly desperate circles. The HR director stopped him mid-sentence with a raised hand. "Mr. Daniels, I think you should stop talking now." Her voice was firm, professional, but I could hear the barely contained anger underneath. She'd been part of accusing me. She'd been part of this charade, and now she was furious at being made complicit in his lie. 2 security officers who'd been waiting outside entered the conference room at a subtle signal from the district manager. My manager, understanding what was happening, started talking even faster. "You don't understand. I was going to put it back. I just needed it temporarily. There were personal circumstances. This isn't what you think." But no one was listening anymore. The security officers positioned themselves on either side of him, professional and efficient. The HR director slid paperwork across the table that I recognized as immediate termination documents. My employee badge, the one that had been taken from me 2 weeks ago, was slid back across the table toward me. This time, everyone in the room looked directly at me. Not with suspicion or judgment or careful neutrality, with embarrassment and apology and carefully suppressed horror at what had almost happened. I picked up my badge slowly, turning it over in my hands. It felt heavier than before, or maybe I just felt the weight of what I'd almost lost. My reputation, my career, my integrity, because someone thought he could make me a convenient scapegoat for his own crime. The fallout happened quickly after that. My manager was escorted from the building by security, no longer an authority figure, but a suspect being removed from the premises. Police were called to file an official report. Corporate compliance launched an investigation into how the initial investigation had been handled so poorly. I was asked to wait in a private office while paperwork was prepared. Within an hour, The HR director returned with the district manager. They offered profuse apologies. They offered immediate reinstatement with back pay for the 2 weeks I'd been suspended. They offered a formal letter clearing my name. They offered a commitment to reviewing and improving their investigation procedures. Their offers were sincere, motivated by genuine remorse and probably significant fear of a lawsuit. I listened to everything they proposed. I asked clarifying questions. I requested written documentation of everything being offered, and then I declined the reinstatement. "I appreciate the apology," I said calmly, "but I won't be returning to work here." I'd already accepted a position elsewhere, at a competing retailer who'd called me for an interview the week before. A place where my reputation hadn't been destroyed. A fresh start. My choice to leave surprised them, I could tell. They'd expected relief, gratitude, maybe tears of joy at being vindicated. Instead, I was professionally declining their offers and walking away from 7 years of history at the company. But I knew something they didn't understand. Some damage can't be undone with apologies and back pay. My coworkers had watched me be accused and said nothing. My manager had deliberately framed me for his crime. The investigation had been so poorly handled it had almost destroyed an innocent person's life. Even cleared of all suspicion, I couldn't go back to that environment. I couldn't work with people who'd so readily believed the worst of me. I couldn't trust a system that had failed so completely. So I took my cleared name, my documented innocence, my written apologies, and I walked out of that building for the final time. The new job paid better anyway, and it came without the weight of betrayal and false accusations. Sometimes the best victory isn't getting your old life back, it's building a better new one. He'd blamed me because he thought I'd stay quiet, thought I was too reliable and compliant to fight back effectively. He'd chosen me as his scapegoat because quiet, dependable employees seem like they won't cause problems. I didn't scream when he accused me. I didn't beg or plead or break down. I didn't give him the emotional reaction he'd expected and probably hoped for. Instead, I waited calmly for the truth to speak for itself. I requested evidence. I documented timelines. I made formal requests that created legal obligations. I stayed professional when every instinct wanted to rage. And when the truth finally played on that screen in that conference room, it was clear, undeniable, and absolutely final. No amount of explanation or deflection could change what those cameras had recorded. He'd thought he could rewrite reality through confident accusations and highlighted logs. But truth doesn't care about confidence. It cares about evidence. And evidence always wins eventually if you're patient enough and brave enough to wait for it. I learned that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's strategy, sometimes it's strength, and sometimes it's the space truth needs to finally be heard.